LAWsome by Consultwebs. Breakthrough insights to build a thriving law firm with your host, Tanner Jones.
Hello, LAWsome listeners. Today on our show, we're talking with Laura Frederick, founder and president of How to Contract, a platform where she helps professionals master their contract drafting and negotiation skills. She's also a managing attorney at Laura Frederick Law, a boutique law firm based in Austin, Texas. She has broad experience in law with 26 years of practicing as an attorney across the globe, from San Francisco all the way to Singapore. Laura also worked at Tesla as a big law commercial contracts attorney. She clearly knows how contracts work in the real world. Today's topic is the art of contract drafting and the negotiation in the legal world. Laura, very happy to have you. Thanks for making time to join us.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So first, let's talk about your career path. You have 26 years of experience in the legal profession, and you've worked with a variety of industries. You've worked with big law. You've worked from San Francisco all across the world. So I can imagine those experiences have obviously compiled and given you some really unique perspective, if you will. And so I'd love to hear kind of what led you to identify the need for companies to have a lawyer specialized in the matter of contracts and negotiation.
Yeah, I think it's actually one of the most common in-house lawyer positions because at the core of every business is their contracts. It's their lifeblood for almost all kinds of businesses across technology. Across the industries, across different technologies, whatever you do, your business is all about your relationships. And your relationships in the modern day are all about contracts. So I had started working in contracts in law firms and then naturally continued when I went in-house.
And based on your experience, what would you say are some of the key advantages to hiring a company like How to Contract instead of maybe a business owner or even a lawyer self-educating themselves, for example?
Yeah, it's a challenge for all of us. And part of the reason I created How to Contract was because I was that lawyer trying to self-educate all my career. And I was very lucky. I had very good mentors. I started in law firms and had worked in a big law firm for 5 years. So I got that training through the mentoring, through working side by side with amazing lawyers. But a lot of lawyers don't have that opportunity. Either they may have started in a law firm and then switched practice areas to something else, or maybe they never took that path and they went straight from law school to an in-house role, or even to a small law firm. And if that's the path, it's really hard to pick up the kind of real world contracting techniques that those of us who've been doing it for a while know. I call it kind of the inside baseball techniques, the things that once you've been doing it for a while, you figured out. But if you're new to it and nobody's showing you the ropes, you don't know. So really, I created this to kind of provide that inside track. The other reason is because there's so much information out there about contracts, and it's really hard to discern what is worthwhile and what's not. And so I created How to Contract really to share my practical experience as somebody, I've worked in big law, I've worked in big companies like Tesla. As you said, I've kind of seen a lot, I know what I'm doing. So I felt like I could convey some of these techniques in a way that makes sense. And I think it resonates with people who hear me talk about contracts and they see that my experience matches their own.
Certainly there's arguably a misconception out there. Some may think that just because you own a business or you're in a corporate position, executive role, that, good contract writing or, solid negotiation skills are there, that they're an assured for the individual. But obviously that's not always the case. It's not only about the theoretical part of in knowing all these concepts, but it's about the practice. It's just as you said, the experiences that lead you to where you're at today. What do you think is the flaw for many lawyers when it comes to contract drafting and negotiation?
I think the hardest thing, and what you could call a flaw, or just could call kind of it's the challenges of drafting, is knowing the big picture about what you're doing. So if you're doing a software license, it's not about the individual provisions. It's really about how does this tool that we're licensing fit into our overall business? Or if you're on the vendor side, what can we offer to our customers? And that goes from everything from the specific license terms and what intellectual property you have to the payment. Are you okay with 30 days, 60 days? Those kind of things, to the really intense limits of liability and indemnification, where you're talking about a corporate kind of risk structure. And so I think it's hard to go from a starting point at a company to knowing how to approach all of those different aspects. And I think that's one of the hardest things about whether you're starting a particular company or starting in your career, is learning how to identify all those risks and how you're going to manage them with your contract.
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest that that's potentially very overwhelming for someone who doesn't have quite the experience that you do. Would you offer any advice for those professionals who may be just kind of stuck in that?
Yeah, I think the key is to think apart. The language to me is secondary. The concepts are first. So when you look at a contract, let's say you're relatively new to contracts and you have a contract that you're supposed to work with a client on, or one of your coworkers, that you focus in on, well, what am I really buying? What do we really need? And then read each sentence for what it says. Because even though there are terms of art, even though there's confusing things in contracts, at its core, it's just writing out what each party is going to do and what each party agrees to. So I think my advice would be, make sure you have that context of what you're doing. Ideally, work with somebody with some experience in contracts who can kind of guide you through, and then at least, not necessarily in the individual negotiation, but overall, invest in learning about practical contract techniques. Because what you learn in law school, or what you learn from kind of professors and academics about contracts, is a little bit different, or a lot of different, from how we actually do things in corporate America and around the world. So I'd encourage people to spend time reading blogs from practitioners, taking courses, taking CLE, really focusing in on learning from experienced practicing lawyers about how things are done.
That's a very solid first step, and it really helps to simplify it when you think about the big picture first and not getting so lost in the legalese
Exactly.
of the contract. I am sure just over these last 26 years, you've spent a wealth of time looking for solid, practical contract training, maybe. And my guess is that while there's value in some of that, a lot of it is just learned from the school of hard knocks and just jumping with both feet in, if you will. Now that you've built this platform that's clearly training professionals on these important subjects, what are some of the key points that lawyers should take into account when they're learning these new skills?
Yeah, I think the most important question is why. And that's really so critical to understanding these points. So why do we change this sentence in the indemnification provision this way? And then keep asking, well, when do we not change it that way? And what's the risk of changing this provision in the negotiation if the other side is requiring we make it something else? Because there are provisions in a contract that honestly don't matter in 99.9999% of contracts. So I'll give the example of severability. It's one of the provisions in the boilerplate, and in a blue moon it will come up and matter. But things like payment and termination and limits of liability, those are provisions that almost always matter. And so really focusing in on those things that are the most important, which typically go to operations. When do I get paid? When do I have to deliver? What do I have to do? or exit, which is term and termination, or finally it's liability if something goes wrong. So if you focus on those kind of big areas, focus on the operational risk and the real big legal risk, yes, ideally you want severability and some of the boilerplate to be right, but making sure the operational, the exit strategy, and the overall limit liability is much more important in my mind.
Yeah, look past the fluff, if you will.
Exactly. And focus on what matters, because
That's it.
it's definitely that 80-20 rule of, you really just got to focus in on what's most important.
My understanding is with obviously thanks to How to Contract, you've helped more than 800 lawyers and professionals improve their contract writing skills. And in turn, you've obviously protected their businesses in that process. You've also worked in a number of different countries, which has obviously given you even more perspective of business in the real world, the legal world, if you will. In that time, what are some of the myths that you've heard about negotiation that people actually believe that you have now an opportunity to really start to push against that myth?
Yeah, I think one of the myths is that you can just use the arguments that someone used against you in your negotiations. So that's one of the main ways that lawyers and a lot of professionals learn how to negotiate is you'll advocate for a position, your counterparty will, explain their reasons why to say no, and then in your next negotiation, when you're on the other side, you use their points with whoever you're negotiating against. And I see this recycling of arguments, but a lot of times those arguments are flawed. They don't make a lot of sense. They're not based in the law. So I think one issue is to be very careful about regurgitating arguments that you make that are made to you. The second thing I'll say is that we have to be really careful in terms of focusing on risk management, and that is ultimately our job. It's not to stop all risk. And so I think a lot of people get nervous and anxious if they are having to agree to terms that they're not happy with. I know I've always felt that way. And it's sort of like, I can't believe you have to sign this contract with this provision. And I get so stressed because I just internalized it all. Mm-hmm. So I think learning that, this myth that you are in control of everything, because we're not. We're able to represent our side, we're able to advocate and do the best we can, but ultimately we don't decide all the terms. It's up to us and the counterparty. And so there's this myth that, I can cause a great outcome with my negotiation. Well, only if the other side is kind of aligned in your same kind of thinking.
So Laura, we've walked through a couple different concepts, the concept of drafting contracts all the way through to negotiation and really just kind of scratching the surface on those. But given LAWsome Podcast is focused on helping the legal community both on the management side, which is a big part of what we've talked about so far, we also guide individuals on the marketing side. And I do want to take a moment to give you a shout out on what I've seen as just a absolutely brilliant idea of you sharing daily contracting tips on your LinkedIn profile, leveraging social media to really brand yourself, to educate the market, and you've coupled your posts with self-made cartoons as well, as again a natural way to stand out. I'd love to hear, how has that experience been so far? What have you seen from that, and any tips or advice you would share with our listeners who may be contemplating a similar idea?
Yeah, I can tell you it's made all the difference in the world. I started posting on LinkedIn daily back in August 2020. And nobody knew who I was, and except the people I'd worked with previously. And over the months of posting daily, and then eventually adding a cartoon to each of my posts, it just transformed everything. And I went from, I had 1,300 followers back when I started, and I think I'm up to about 28 or 29,000 now. And I've never advertised or anything like that. So I strongly encourage LinkedIn, not only for business development and brand awareness, but also for community. We've grown this contract community on LinkedIn of people who are Some are very enthusiastic and very into contracts. Others are more passive, just looking to learn extra, a little bit extra with their coffee. But I find participating in that, a lot of us have created connections. I get a ton of work from my post, from connecting. So I think there's definitely an investment to be made with some time on social media. But if you're targeting your content to what you want to be known for and what you want to accomplish. So for me, I was trying to grow my law firm. I wanted more people to know who I was. But not only that, but to recognize that I have expertise in my subject matter. So
Absolutely.
that's where the idea of posting contract tips. So if you just go on and post pictures of your kids, or you comment on a social, a big news headline, you may or may not get that recognition. But if you're really trying to go for a professional acknowledgement and reputation, then I recommend posting in your subject matter. Most people should pick two, three, four subjects and stick to those, because that way people start associating you with those topics, and then they look for you when they're scrolling through and they're like, oh, Laura's going to post something on contracts. I'll stop and read there. And then the cartoons was almost I discovered by accident, just wanting to create images to go with my post to make them more attractive. And so I had learned a lot over the years about using color. And so I have my brand color is kind of a Kelly green, so I use that for the background of each of my cartoons. And people talk about how useful that is, because as they scroll through LinkedIn, if they see the green, they stop. So I think that's been a big advantage too.
So many tips there. So I would just encourage anyone listening who, you've been contemplating this concept, this idea, and, whether it's you yourself holding you back or something else, push back on those excuses, get started. And I'd imagine, would you say, Laura, has it gotten easier once you've built momentum in this process?
Definitely, definitely. Because now I think it's up to 650 days in a row that I've posted. And I almost all of those days I've engaged at least a little bit on LinkedIn, some days more than others. But I think my writing, I look at the tips that I wrote when I started, and I can see how much better they are. Or other people that I work with who do social media posting, they'll send me things to write. And I'll be like, this headline's not going to grab anybody's attention. It's not organized in bite-sized chunks. I've learned a lot about how to do it. So it's so much easier now than it used to be. And I think I've become a better lawyer for it too, because I double check my points before I post. So it forced me to double check. But then the other side benefit is I often have other lawyers who comment, and they either round out my knowledge, or in some cases they'll say, well, I don't know that that's right, Laura. I think it's this other thing. I'm like, oh yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for sharing. So it's a very, I think in contrast, Twitter tends to be a little bit more pointed in the comments, but I find LinkedIn that's a very supportive environment where people have these discussions in a very polite and respectful way.
Laura, I'd like to ask, just as we wrap up here, any advice that you'd love to share with our listeners that maybe we haven't covered so far in this discussion?
Yeah, I think what I've found especially for LinkedIn, and I'd focus on that, is people think nobody wants to hear what I have to say. Who am I? I'm not that special. you know, but the thing is, we all come from our own background, our own experiences, and nobody has that combination. Nobody's been through what you've been through. And there's always somebody who can learn from us and what we've gone through. So, my biggest advice, if somebody's new to posting on LinkedIn or social media, is focus 100% on how you can help other people. That, if you keep that as your focus, don't worry about what we call the humble brag of, oh, my clients gave me these compliments. Those don't go over very well. But if you talk about, hey, this is how you can do this thing that I know about that you might not know, or this was my experience and the lessons I learned. If you focus on that kind of thing, it's those posts and your brand will go so much further than just trying to check a box and post every day.
I agree, and I've seen that time and time again be proven through, the ones that are willing to be authentic, to give value, to really seek ways to just give. Those are the ones who often gain the most trust in that process, and you've proven that. Laura, we're grateful for the time you've shared with us today and all the nuggets of wisdom you've given. For listeners who are interested in reaching out to you, what's the best way that they can contact you?
Sure, the best way is probably on LinkedIn. I get lots of direct messages every day. So just connect with me. I'm an open connector. I accept all connections. So just connect with me on LinkedIn, Laura Frederick. And then you can also go on my website, which is howtocontract.com, and you'll see what we've got to offer, and you can reach out to Laura at howtocontract.com.
Thank you, Laura.
LAWsome by Consultwebs with Tanner Jones. For show notes, links, and info, go to consultwebs.com/podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Watch for the next LAWsome episode to discover more breakthrough insights to build a thriving law firm.